Okay, so we've covered jQuery syntax, at least to start. The next thing that we need to talk about before we go any further is those selectors. Okay, so in the previous example, I had a button in my HTML, and if you recall, I selected it with $, parentheses, and in quotations, button. Okay, now jQuery statements accept 4 different kinds of selectors, essentially. 4 different kinds of selectors. The first type of selector is an element or type selector, which is what we see up here with button. The second type is a class selector. So that would look something like this, dot box in quotation marks. And the third one is an ID selector. Something like #CTA. And finally, there's the this selector. This does not use quotes. It looks like this. The same rules for this apply in jQuery as they do in vanilla JavaScript, but that is a larger conversation. I will give you a demo of how this as a selector can be hugely useful in jQuery a little bit later. But for now, don't focus on this one too much. Know that it's there, and if you're confident using this in vanilla JavaScript, then you should feel confident using this as a selector in jQuery. Works exactly the same. More importantly, though, are these first 3 selectors, which hopefully you've all noticed are essentially nothing but CSS selectors. Okay, we've got an element type selector, class selector, and ID selector. The same types and the same kind of selectors which we use in CSS. So any selector that you could use in CSS when writing your styles in your style sheet, you could similarly use to select elements in your HTML in jQuery. So let's take a moment and walk through the vanilla JavaScript equivalents to these. The easiest for that is going to be the ID selector. If I wanted to select in jQuery the element with the ID of CTA, this is exactly how I would do it. Now, the best way to drive this and other good habits home for you guys is going to be when you need to use jQuery in your first couple of experiences with jQuery. Don't ever let yourself use it as a crutch. jQuery is an enormously helpful tool that can be the perfect fit for certain situations. But most of the time, jQuery doesn't exist in a vacuum. jQuery is heavily informed by vanilla JavaScript, and you may often find yourself needing to convert between vanilla JavaScript and jQuery, simply to solve a problem, for example. jQuery doesn't quite allow you to get under the hood as much as vanilla JavaScript does. So it is always a good habit to feel confident translating from one to the other. So that's what we're going to do here while talking about selectors. If I wanted to select the element with the ID of CTA, this is the jQuery selector. And that's exactly what this is. This is selecting the element with the ID of CTA. If I wanted to, I could store it in a variable just like this. And as long as there is an element with this ID somewhere in my HTML, that HTML node, that element, is going to be contained in this variable. Okay, I can do that. But what is the vanilla JavaScript equivalent to this? Well, hopefully this should be easy for you guys. It's document.getElementById, and in parentheses and quotations, CTA, the ID that we are looking for. Okay, note that jQuery uses the hashtag like a CSS selector. getElementById does not. It only uses the ID name, not the symbol as well. Okay, that's important. Hopefully you know that by now. Either of these statements, if you have jQuery hooked up to your document, will return the same element. Either of them can be stored in a variable like so. Either of them can later be used in your code however you'd like. Okay, so that's ID and ID selectors in jQuery. What about class selectors? Well, hopefully by now you feel confident using document.getElementsByClassName. And once again, we're not including the symbol in here, just the name of the class itself. Get elements, note the S at the end of element, get elements by class name. But ask yourself, what is this going to return? If I create a variable box and store this, the value of this statement, in the variable box, and then call box in my console, what is it going to return? The answer is an array-like collection of HTML elements. Okay? Even if there's only one element with a class of box, what's going to return is going to look like and behave like an array. If there's 10 elements with the class of box, that array is going to have 10 items, 10 elements with the class of box. The same goes for a jQuery selector by class. Okay? This is one of those areas where jQuery can be especially useful, and I'll explain why in a moment. But both $, parentheses, quotation mark, dot box, close quotation, close parentheses, and document.getElementsByClassName, parentheses, quotation, box, close quotation, close parentheses, will return an array-like collection of HTML elements which all have this class. Okay? Now, it stands to reason that the exact same thing, except in this case using tag name, works for element and type selectors. And that is absolutely true. Okay? The distinction here is, well, I'm not going to get into that. In order to explain what you need to be wary of here, understand that if I wanted to execute a function anytime you clicked on any element with the class box, let's see how we would do that using jQuery. I'm going to come down here. It would be, let's see, when I click on any element with class box, I want to do stuff. Doesn't matter what right now. I want to do stuff. So what is our target? Let's divide this sentence up. When I click on any element with class of box. Click is, again, a very common jQuery method. So I'm going to select all elements with the class of box. And when I click on it, on any element with that class of box, I want to run a function which does stuff. That is how I would do that with jQuery. Okay? But how would I do that with vanilla JavaScript? Document.getElementsByClassName box. Okay, that takes care of this part. Remember, this returns an array-like collection of elements. And then what? Can I add an event listener? onto an array? The answer is no. The answer is no, you cannot. You want to add an event listener to each item in this array. So in reality, if you wanted to do this with vanilla JavaScript, we'd have to store this array in a variable and write a for loop and take each item in the array and add an event listener to it, which does stuff. This is considerably more complicated than this. Okay, so this is one of those areas where jQuery can really shine for you. If we want to perform an identical function on an identical event on every single element with this class name, jQuery does it much quicker, much easier than vanilla JavaScript. It's still critical that you know how to do this. Okay? So document.getElements by class name is returning something like .box, .box, .box. They're probably, let's say they're all divs. It's going to be div.box, div.box, div.box. And each one of these is going to represent a div with the class of box in our HTML. But we cannot add an event listener listening for a click event on an array. It just doesn't work. An array is not the appropriate data type, and this click event is never going to be heard. It's just not going to work. It's going to throw an error. What we need to do is add this event listener for a click event on every individual div.box. And so, using this array, we write a for loop and add that event listener to every item in that array. Okay, that is for loop logic at its most fundamental. But jQuery allows us to do this. This is the framework for a function that will allow us to execute any kind of code we want whenever a user clicks on an element with the class of box. The same exact thing will go for, let me bring this up and move down a little bit. Same exact thing applies for element or type selectors. If you want every button in your HTML to do the exact same thing when clicked, then this will suffice as jQuery. But to use vanilla JavaScript, we would need to select all of our buttons, and write a for loop that loops through all of those buttons. And for each button, we would need to add an event listener, which runs a function that does something. Okay? Take a moment to digest that. Take a moment to digest that. jQuery allows you to select any and all of a given element type or a given class type, element with a specific class type, at once and perform or assign things individually to those elements without having to loop. Okay? If you got lost on that, please take some time to rewind, watch this video again. If you're not confident in the vanilla JavaScript component of this video, it's okay. It's still early. You're only a couple weeks in, but why don't you take that vanilla JavaScript and practice with it for a couple minutes? Take a half hour, make an HTML web page that has 6 image elements in it, all with the same source, and then try to use get elements by tag name or get elements by class name to select all of those images, loop through all of those images, and change the sources of all of those images so that when you click a button, all 6 images change to something else. Try that with vanilla JavaScript and try to appreciate the effort that that takes. Then try it with jQuery. Rather than button here, you would be selecting IMG. Or you would be selecting button on click, but the function you'd be running would select all of your images, and it would target their sources, and it would change them to something else. Okay? Give that a try. Don't stress if the logic here is still feels a little bit beyond you, but practice it, give it some thought, give it a little time to digest, and take note of how much easier jQuery selectors and jQuery selectors alone can make your lives. Okay, so once more to review, jQuery accepts any CSS selector. Okay, and it doesn't have to be one simple selector. It can be a compound statement. That works. That's valid. Okay, or that's valid. Any selector that would work in CSS will work in JavaScript. In addition, jQuery takes the this selector, which we'll take a closer look at a little bit later.